The auction block stood weathered and stained beneath the harsh April sun, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward Mae Whitlock like gnarled fingers seeking to drag her deeper into nightmare. She pressed her back against the rough wooden post, her calloused hands gripping the fabric of her only decent dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days before her father's debts consumed everything of value they'd once possessed. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty yard of Copper Creek, his words cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk, each syllable another step toward a future she couldn't bear to contemplate. What am I bid for this healthy young woman? Good breeding stock, can work a farm, cook, clean, and tend to a man's needs proper like. Starting bid at $50. Mae's stomach lurched as hands shot up around the crowd like weeds sprouting from poisoned soil. These weren't the faces of men seeking wives but buyers examining livestock, their eyes calculating her worth in terms of labor potential and physical durability. Her father stood off to the side, unable to meet her eyes, his shoulders bent with the weight of shame and desperation that had driven him to this unthinkable act. The gambling debts had finally come due, and she was the only asset left to settle accounts with the territorial loan sharks who'd been circling their failing homestead like vultures sensing approaching death. 60, called out Jeremiah Haskell, a thick-set man with yellowed teeth who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. His reputation for working his hands to death was matched only by whispered stories about what happened to the women who found themselves under his roof. The bruises on his previous housekeeper's arms had told a story the woman herself had been too frightened to speak aloud, and Mae had heard the rumors about midnight visits to servants' quarters that left young women hollow-eyed and desperate to escape. 75. This from Morton Clegg, whose previous wife had died under mysterious circumstances barely 6 months after their union. The bruises on her arms at the funeral had told a story the preacher hadn't dared address from his pulpit, though the women of the town had exchanged knowing looks over their sewing circles and wondered how long it would be before Clegg came shopping for a replacement. His current bid carried the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and brute force. Mae closed her eyes, feeling the weight of despair settle over her like a burial shroud woven from broken dreams and lost hope. At 19, she'd nursed her mother through consumption, kept their small farm running when her father took to drink and gambling, and taught herself to read using her mother's cherished Bible and the few other books that had survived their steady descent into poverty. She'd sold eggs and vegetables to neighboring families, mended clothes for coins, despite her father's increasingly erratic behavior. None of that mattered now. She was chattel, a commodity to be sold to settle debts she'd never incurred, trapped by circumstances beyond her control and the legal reality that unmarried women had few rights and fewer options in territorial law. The bidding continued around her like a grotesque parody of a livestock auction, each increase in price marking another step toward a fate that made her skin crawl with revulsion. She thought of her mother's gentle hands teaching her to embroider, of quiet evenings spent reading aloud from scripture, of dreams of someday finding a man who would love her for her mind as well as her abilities. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, as remote as the snow-capped mountains that rose beyond the dusty streets of Copper Creek. $100. The voice that cut through the bidding war was deep, quiet, and unfamiliar to most of the assembled crowd. Mae opened her eyes to see a tall figure stepping forward from the shadows near the blacksmith shop, moving with the measured pace of a man accustomed to working with fire and steel. Thomas Kane filled out a clean white shirt that contrasted sharply with his sun-darkened hands, his broad shoulders carrying themselves with the quiet confidence that came from years of honest labor and hard-won skill. She'd seen him around town for the better part of 2 years, always polite but never speaking more than necessary to conduct his business. The silent blacksmith who'd appeared one day with enough coin to purchase the abandoned forge and had been methodically building a reputation for honest work and fair dealing ever since. His presence at the auction surprised many of the assembled townspeople, who'd grown accustomed to Thomas Kane's pattern of avoiding social gatherings and public spectacles. He kept to himself, conducted his business with quiet efficiency, and had shown no previous interest in acquiring female companionship through conventional or unconventional means. Yet here he stood, his blue eyes steady and calm as he faced down men who'd expected to divide the spoils among themselves without outside interference. "Did you hear me?" Thomas's voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet auction yard, cutting through the murmur of surprised conversations. $100. Cash money, to be paid immediately upon completion of sale. The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in midair, his weathered face showing confusion at this unexpected development. Haskell's face flushed red with indignation, his thick fingers clenching into fists as he realized his careful plans were being disrupted by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant. Clegg muttered curses under his breath, his small eyes darting between Thomas and Mae as he calculated whether the prize was worth escalating the conflict. Neither man was prepared to match such a substantial bid for what they'd expected to purchase at bargain rates, their confidence shaken by the quiet determination of the newcomer. 100 going once. The auctioneer's voice held a note of uncertainty, his long experience in such matters telling him this wasn't how these proceedings typically unfolded. Sales like this were usually arranged in advance, with interested parties reaching informal agreements about acceptable bid ranges. The presence of an outsider with both the means and the will to disrupt established patterns created complications nobody had anticipated. Going twice. Mae held her breath, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself from praying that this unexpected intervention might save her from the fate that had seemed inevitable just moments before. She knew nothing about Thomas Kane beyond his reputation for skilled work and honest dealing, but anything had to be better than the alternatives represented by Haskell and Clegg. Sold to the blacksmith. The words rang out like a bell tolling the end of one life and the beginning of another. Mae felt her knees buckle as the crowd began to disperse, most folks heading toward the saloon to discuss this unexpected turn of events over glasses of rotgut whiskey and locally brewed beer. The excitement of the auction was over, but the gossip it would generate would fuel conversations for weeks to come. Thomas approached the auction platform with steady steps, reaching into his leather vest to produce a roll of bills that he counted out with precise movements. The money changed hands quickly, along with papers that made the transaction legal in the eyes of territorial law, regardless of what moral reservations some observers might harbor about the entire proceeding. Mae watched the exchange with a mixture of relief and apprehension, understanding that her immediate crisis was resolved but uncertain about what new challenges lay ahead. Her father shuffled forward, his hat clutched in trembling hands that showed the effects of too much drink and too little honest work. "Tom, I want you to know." "Don't?" Thomas's single word cut through whatever justification or explanation was about to follow, delivered with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Just don't." Mae watched her father nod and walk away without another word, disappearing into the crowd like morning mist burned away by rising sun. She stood frozen on the platform, uncertain of what came next, until Thomas extended his hand toward her with the same careful attention he might show when handling delicate metalwork. "Miss Whitlock? We should go." His palm was warm and roughened by years of honest labor, marked with small scars from working hot metal but gentle in its touch. She hesitated only a moment before accepting his help down from the block, the brief contact somehow steadying in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet like earthquake-loosened ground. His touch was respectful, proper, offering support without presumption or ownership. "I don't understand," she whispered as they walked away from the dispersing crowd, her voice barely audible above the sound of departing horses and wagons. "Why would you?" Because no woman deserves to be sold like livestock, Thomas replied without hesitation, his words delivered in the same measured tone he might use to discuss the weather or the price of iron stock. And because I've got need of help around the forge and homestead. Seems like we might be able to help each other out. They walked in silence through the dusty streets of Copper Creek, past the general store where Mrs. Henderson peered at them through her front window with unconcealed curiosity, past the church where Reverend Matthews was tending his small garden of vegetables with the patient attention of a man who understood the value of nurturing growing things, past the saloon where the sound of raucous laughter spilled out into the afternoon air like water from a broken dam. Mae kept her eyes fixed on the ground before her feet, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that followed in their wake and the weight of curious stares from people who thought they knew her story but understood nothing of its complexity. The attention felt like a physical burden pressing down on her shoulders, each glance and murmured comment another reminder that her life had become public entertainment for people who had nothing better to occupy their time. She'd grown up in this town, had played with some of these children, had sold vegetables to their mothers and helped their grandmothers with heavy lifting when arthritis made simple tasks difficult. Now she was walking among them as a purchased woman, her status fundamentally altered by circumstances she'd been powerless to prevent. Thomas seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he was simply accustomed to being the subject of speculation and gossip. His steady pace never wavered, his expression remained calm and focused, and he offered no acknowledgement of the whispered conversations that swirled around them like dust devils in a summer wind. His composure was reassuring in its steadiness, suggesting a man comfortable with his own decisions regardless of what others might think. Thomas's homestead sat a quarter-mile outside town, nestled against a grove of cottonwoods that provided blessed shade from the relentless sun and shelter from the winter winds that could make life miserable for those foolish enough to build in exposed locations. The main house was small but well built, with a covered porch that spoke of evenings spent watching sunsets paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, of quiet contemplation and peaceful solitude. Behind the house stood the forge, its chimney reaching skyward like a finger pointing toward heaven, smoke rising from banked fires that never fully died. Beyond that stretched a modest barn that housed a pair of horses and several milk cows, along with the usual collection of chickens, pigs, and other livestock that made frontier homesteads largely self-sufficient. The property showed evidence of careful planning and steady improvement over time. Fences were straight and well maintained, buildings showed fresh repairs and regular upkeep, and the kitchen garden visible behind the house displayed the orderly rows and healthy growth that indicated someone who understood both the science and art of coaxing food from often reluctant soil. This was a working homestead built for long-term success rather than quick profit, the kind of place that could support a family in comfort if managed with skill and dedication. "There's a room in the back of the house," Thomas said as they approached the front steps, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone making an effort not to presume anything about their arrangement. "It's got a window facing east to catch the morning light, and I built a writing desk near it last winter. Thought someday I might have need of such things." Mae paused at the bottom of the porch steps, her hand resting on the smooth wood of the railing that showed evidence of careful sanding and regular maintenance. The moment felt suspended between past and future, between the life she'd lost and whatever lay ahead. "Mr. Kane, I need to understand what's expected of me here." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she noticed the startling blue of his eyes, like chips of summer sky embedded in a face that had seen its share of hardship and loss. There was kindness in those eyes, but also a careful reserve that suggested a man who'd learned to guard his emotions and trust slowly. "You're not my property, Miss Whitlock. The law might say different, but I don't put much stock in laws that treat people like goods to be bought and sold. You'll work for your keep, same as anyone else, but you'll be treated with respect and dignity." That's a promise I'm making to you right here and now. And if I wanted to leave? The question came out more challengingly than she'd intended, but she needed to understand the boundaries of her situation. Then you'd leave. His response came without hesitation, delivered with a sincerity that took her breath away. Though I'd ask you to give me fair warning so I could help you get settled somewhere safe. I've got contacts in other territories, people who might be able to help you make a fresh start if that's what you decide you want. Mae felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen for the first time in months, like a knot slowly working itself free under patient fingers. The sensation was almost dizzying after so many weeks of feeling trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Why would you do this for a stranger? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains that rose like purple sentinels in the distance, their snow-capped peaks catching the afternoon light in ways that made them seem both impossibly distant and reassuringly permanent. Because I know what it's like to have no choices left, and I swore if I ever had the means to help someone else find their way clear of that kind of trap, I would. There was pain in his voice when he spoke of having no choices, the kind of deep hurt that came from personal experience rather than abstract sympathy. Mae found herself wondering what circumstances had brought him to Copper Creek, what losses or disappointments had shaped his understanding of desperation and the value of second chances. But she sensed that such questions would have to wait for trust to develop between them, for the careful process of revelation that characterized all meaningful relationships. He showed her through the house with the careful attention of a man accustomed to living alone but trying to see his space through someone else's eyes. The main room held a stone fireplace flanked by two chairs that looked hand-built, their simple lines and solid construction speaking of both practical skill and aesthetic sensibility. A kitchen table scarred by years of use dominated one corner, its surface marked with the kind of honest wear that came from daily service rather than neglect. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that spoke of quiet evenings spent reading by lamplight and a mind that sought improvement through study and reflection. The collection was impressive for a frontier homestead, volumes on metallurgy and engineering, but also literature, philosophy, and even poetry. Mae ran her fingers along the spine of a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's complete works, noting the careful repairs that had been made to extend its useful life. "You're well read," she observed. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married," Thomas explained, his voice warming slightly at the memory. "She always said that books were windows to worlds we might never see otherwise, and that a person who stopped learning was already halfway to being dead." The bedroom he'd mentioned was indeed small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered by a quilt worked in shades of blue and green that reminded Mae of her mother's careful stitching. The promised writing desk sat beneath the window, its surface clear and ready for use, with paper, pens, and ink arranged with military precision in small compartments along its edge. Someone had put thought into making this space both functional and welcoming, though Mae suspected it had remained unused since its completion. "I'll leave you to get settled," Thomas said, pausing in the doorway with the awkward courtesy of a man unaccustomed to sharing his private space. "There's fresh water in the pitcher, and I've got stew simmering that should be ready come supper time. We can talk about work arrangements tomorrow when you've had time to catch your breath." Mae waited until she heard the front door close before sinking onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back all day to fall. They came in great, shuddering sobs that seemed to rise from some deep well of fear and relief she hadn't even known existed. The emotional release was overwhelming, months of accumulated tension and despair pouring out in waves that left her feeling emptied and strangely peaceful. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was safe. The knowledge felt strange and fragile, like a soap bubble that might burst if she examined it too closely, but it was real nonetheless. She was under the protection of a man who had asked for nothing in return except honest work, who had treated her with more respect in one afternoon than her own father had shown in months of gambling away their security and future. The days that followed took on a rhythm that surprised Mae with its gentleness and lack of conflict. Thomas rose before dawn to tend the animals, and she found herself waking to the sound of his quiet movements in the kitchen as he prepared coffee and simple breakfast fare. He never expected her to cook for him, instead treating meals as a shared responsibility that they approached with the same practical efficiency they brought to other household tasks. Her first morning, she'd emerged from her room to find him standing at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal with the focused attention he brought to all his work. His hair was still damp from washing, and he'd put on a clean shirt that spoke of a man who understood the importance of starting each day properly groomed and prepared. "Morning, Miss Whitlock. Coffee's ready if you'd like some. Please call me Mae." She'd accepted the tin cup he offered, inhaling the rich aroma that spoke of beans roasted to perfection and brewed with care. "And thank you, Thomas." He'd nodded toward the pot, his movements economical and precise. "Hope you don't mind oatmeal. It's simple but filling, and I've got honey to sweeten it if you'd like." They'd eaten in comfortable silence, two people learning to share space without the awkwardness that might have been expected given the unusual circumstances of their arrangement. Mae found herself studying his hands as he ate, broad, capable hands marked with small scars from years of working hot metal, yet gentle enough to handle the delicate china cup that had clearly been his mother's. There was something reassuring about watching him perform these simple domestic tasks, a normalcy that helped counteract the strangeness of her situation. After breakfast, Thomas had shown her the forge, explaining his work with the same quiet pride she'd noticed in everything he touched. The space was organized with military precision, every tool in its proper place, the fire banked but ready to roar back to life when needed. Orders were stacked neatly on a shelf near the door: horseshoes for the banker's mare, hinges for Mrs. Patterson's new gate, a set of kitchen knives for the hotel in the next town over. "I could use help with the books," he'd said, gesturing toward a desk covered with papers that showed signs of a man more comfortable with hammer and anvil than pen and ledger. "And there's always mending to be done, cleaning, tending the garden. But you're free to find your own way of being useful. I'm not one to micromanage honest work." Mae had nodded, already mentally cataloging the ways she could contribute to the smooth running of the homestead. It felt good to have purpose again, to wake each morning knowing there were tasks that needed her attention and skills that could be put to productive use. The sense of being needed, of having value beyond her potential as breeding stock or manual labor, was like water to someone dying of thirst. The garden became her first real project, a patch of ground behind the house that Thomas had started the previous spring but lacked the knowledge to make truly productive. The soil was good, the location received adequate sunlight and protection from harsh winds, but the planning and planting showed the efforts of someone working more from hope than experience. Mae spent hours working the earth, her hands remembering the lessons her mother had taught about companion planting and proper spacing, about the importance of soil preparation and the timing of different crops. She divided her time between the vegetables that would provide practical nutrition and a small plot where she began cultivating herbs: sage for seasoning, lavender for its calming scent, chamomile for tea on sleepless nights, mint for cooling drinks during the hot summer months ahead. Thomas watched her work with quiet approval, occasionally offering to help with the heavier tasks but otherwise leaving her to approach the project in her own way. She appreciated his restraint, the way he respected her competence without feeling the need to oversee or correct her methods. It was a form of respect she'd rarely experienced, the acknowledgement that she might actually know what she was doing. "You've got a gift with growing things," he commented one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "My mother would have liked you." She always said a garden was a sign of hope made visible. It was the first personal thing he'd shared about his past, and Mae found herself hungry for more details about the man who'd saved her from a fate worse than death. But she sensed that Thomas revealed himself slowly, like morning light creeping across the valley, and pushing for information would only cause him to retreat behind the walls of silence he'd built around his private pain. Instead, she began to share small pieces of her own story during their quiet evening conversations, testing the waters of trust and finding them surprisingly warm. How her mother had taught her to read using Bible verses, starting with simple passages and gradually working up to more complex theological discussions. The way her father had changed after the consumption took his wife, the gradual slide from modest prosperity into the desperate poverty that had led to the auction block. "He wasn't always like that," she said one night, referring to her father's gambling and drinking. "After Mama died, it was like he lost his way and couldn't find the path back to being the man she'd married." "Grief does strange things to people," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Some folks turn toward others for comfort, and some turn away from everything that reminds them of what they've lost." Mae sensed there was a story behind his understanding, but she didn't press. They were both learning to trust, and trust couldn't be rushed any more than spring could be hurried by wishing for warmer weather. The foundation they were building together needed to be solid, constructed of honest communication and mutual respect rather than hasty intimacy that might crumble under pressure. The weeks passed with surprising speed, each day bringing new routines and small discoveries about each other's habits and preferences. Mae threw herself into the work of making the homestead run smoothly, rising early to help with the milking, spending mornings in the garden, and afternoons helping Thomas with the business side of his blacksmithing operation. She had a neat hand with figures and a talent for organizing the paperwork that had been piling up in chaotic stacks around his workspace. "You've got a head for business," he observed one afternoon, watching her reconcile a particularly complicated invoice. "These books haven't looked this orderly since I started keeping them." Mae felt a flush of pride at the compliment, warmth spreading through her chest like honey stirred into hot tea. It had been a long time since anyone had praised her abilities or treated her contributions as valuable rather than simply expected. "I like bringing order to chaos. There's something satisfying about making sense of tangled numbers." "Like untangling yarn," Thomas said with a slight smile. "My mother used to say that about her needlework. The messier the knot, the more satisfaction in working it loose." These glimpses into his past were rare treasures that Mae stored away carefully, building a picture of the man who'd chosen to help her when no one else would. She learned that his mother had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, which explained the books that lined his shelves and his own obvious education. She discovered that he'd served in the territorial militia for several years, which accounted for the military precision in his daily routines and the watchful way his eyes scanned their surroundings whenever they went into town together. But the deeper mysteries of his past remained locked away, and Mae respected his privacy even as her curiosity grew. She understood the need to protect old wounds from casual examination, having plenty of her own scars that she wasn't ready to expose to even the gentlest scrutiny. Their relationship was growing like a well-tended garden, slowly but with deep roots that would weather whatever storms might come. The first real test of their arrangement came on a Saturday morning in early May when Jeremiah Haskell rode up to the forge with a broken harness buckle and an attitude that set Mae's teeth on edge like nails scraping across slate. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard his voice carrying across the yard, loud and demanding in the way of men accustomed to getting their own way through intimidation and the implied threat of economic retaliation. "Kane, I need this fixed and I need it today. Can't wait around for you to get to it when the mood strikes you." Thomas's response was measured and calm, delivered in the same professional tone he used for all his business dealings regardless of his personal feelings about the customer. "I can have it ready by Tuesday morning, Mr. Haskell. Got 3 other jobs ahead of yours, and they're being completed in the order they were received." "Tuesday." Haskell's voice rose with indignation, carrying the petulant tone of a child denied a desired toy. "I'm telling you I need it today, and I'm willing to pay extra for the rush work. Double your usual rate if you drop everything else and fix this immediately. And I'm telling you Tuesday is the earliest I can manage without breaking my word to other customers." Thomas's voice remained steady, but Mae could hear the steel beneath the politeness. "You're welcome to take it to Peterson over in Millfield if that doesn't suit your schedule." Mae peered around the corner of the house to see Haskell's face growing red with frustration, his thick hands clenching and unclenching as he struggled with the unfamiliar experience of being told no by someone he considered beneath his social station. He clearly wasn't accustomed to being refused by anyone, let alone the quiet blacksmith who'd outbid him at the auction and disrupted his carefully laid plans. "This is about that girl, isn't it?" Haskell's voice turned ugly, taking on the nasty undertone that appeared whenever his authority was challenged. "You're still sore about losing the bidding, so you're taking it out on legitimate customers who've been doing business in this town since before you arrived." Thomas's hammer stopped its steady rhythm against the anvil, the sudden silence somehow more ominous than any raised voice could have been. When he spoke, his words carried a note of warning that made Mae's breath catch in her throat. "My business practices have nothing to do with personal matters, Mr. Haskell. I treat all customers fairly and complete work in the order it's received. That's how I've always operated, and it's how I'll continue to operate." "Fairness." Haskell spat in the dust near his boots, his contempt evident in both word and gesture. "What's fair about a man paying good money for something and then having it stolen away by some outsider who don't understand how things work around here? What's fair about disrupting established arrangements because you took a fancy to something that weren't meant for you?" The silence that followed was thick with tension, heavy as the air before a summer thunderstorm. Mae found herself holding her breath, waiting to see how Thomas would respond to the challenge embedded in Haskell's words. The confrontation felt like a moment of truth that would define the nature of their life in this community going forward. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet, carrying the kind of controlled menace that was far more frightening than any shout. "I'd suggest you collect your buckle and take your business elsewhere, Mr. Haskell. Right now. Before one of us says something we can't take back." "You threatening me, Kane?" Haskell's bluster couldn't quite hide the uncertainty that had crept into his voice. He was a bully, accustomed to intimidating people who couldn't fight back, but something in Thomas's manner warned him that he might have misjudged his opponent. "I'm giving you good advice. Free of charge." Thomas set down his hammer with deliberate precision, his movements controlled but somehow menacing. "Take it or leave it, but make your decision quickly." Haskell stood there for another long moment, clearly struggling with the desire to escalate the confrontation and the practical knowledge that Thomas Kane was not a man to be pushed beyond his limits. His reputation for quiet competence apparently extended beyond his metalworking skills, and even a man of Haskell's limited imagination could recognize danger when it presented itself with such calm certainty. Finally, he snatched up his broken harness piece and stalked toward his horse, his face purple with frustrated rage. "This ain't over, Kane. You can't hide behind that forge forever, and when you come to town, remember that some of us have long memories and longer reaches than you might expect." Thomas waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before resuming his work, but Mae could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw remained tightly clenched despite his outward appearance of calm. She finished hanging the laundry with quick, efficient movements, then made her way to the forge where she found him hammering a piece of iron with more force than the job actually required. "You all right?" she asked softly, not wanting to intrude if he needed time to work through his anger in private. "Fine." The word came out clipped and short, but after a moment he set down his hammer and turned to face her, his expression softening as he registered her concern. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. Haskell's not used to being told no, and he's got a mean streak when he doesn't get his way." "Is he dangerous?" Mae asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the careful way Thomas had handled the confrontation. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his response with the same methodical attention he brought to all his work. "He's got influence in this town, and he's not above using it to make life difficult for folks who cross him. But dangerous in the sense of physical harm? I don't think so. He's more the type to strike from hiding, use underhanded tactics rather than face-to-face confrontation." Mae nodded, filing away this information for future reference. She'd grown up around men like Haskell, bullies who relied on intimidation and social pressure to get their way rather than honest effort or legitimate authority. The key to dealing with such people was never showing fear, even when fear was exactly what you felt churning in your stomach like bad meat. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing up to him. I know it might make things harder for your business. My business will survive just fine without Jeremiah Haskell's patronage." Thomas picked up his hammer again, but his movements had returned to their usual controlled rhythm. "And nobody talks about you that way in my hearing. Nobody." The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through Mae's chest, a feeling she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. It had been a long time since anyone had been willing to defend her honor or treat her dignity as something worth protecting. The sensation was both comforting and unsettling, stirring emotions that felt dangerous in their intensity. The confrontation with Haskell proved to be just the beginning of a campaign of petty harassment that unfolded over the following weeks like a slow-acting poison working its way through the community's bloodstream. Orders that had been promised to Thomas were mysteriously withdrawn, longtime customers began taking their business to blacksmiths in neighboring towns, and Mae noticed the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever they appeared in the general store or post office. The economic pressure was subtle but unmistakable, designed to gradually strangle Thomas's business without providing clear evidence of organized boycotting that might trigger community backlash. It was the kind of sophisticated vindictiveness that required coordination and influence, proving that Haskell had both the will and the means to make good on his implied threats. Through it all, Thomas maintained his usual calm demeanor, but Mae could see the strain beginning to show around the edges like cracks in a carefully maintained facade. His savings were substantial enough to weather a temporary downturn in business, but the systematic nature of the campaign suggested it would continue until either he capitulated to community pressure or found a way to shift the balance of power in his favor. "Maybe we should consider leaving," Mae suggested one evening as they sat on the porch, the silence around them feeling more oppressive than peaceful. "Starting over somewhere else where we wouldn't have to deal with this kind of persecution." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains that seemed to change color with the shifting light. "Running away won't solve anything. Men like Haskell exist everywhere, and if we establish a pattern of retreating every time someone makes life difficult, we'll spend our whole lives running. But if staying means watching your business destroyed, then we find another way." His voice carried the quiet determination that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "I've worked too hard to build something worthwhile here to let it be destroyed by a petty tyrant with a bruised ego." The solution, when it came, arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor on a warm morning in late May when the spring air carried the scent of wildflowers and new growth. Mae was in the garden, checking the progress of her tomato plants and planning the summer expansion that would provide enough vegetables to sell as well as feed their household, when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the road. A small group of riders was approaching the homestead, led by a woman whose bearing and dress immediately marked her as someone of considerable consequence. Eleanor Patterson rode side saddle with the practiced ease of someone born to wealth and position, her dark hair pinned beneath a stylish hat that probably cost more than most folks in Copper Creek saw in a month of hard labor. Behind her rode two men who had the look of professional security, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings with the alert attention of those paid to anticipate trouble. And bringing up the rear was a pack horse loaded with supplies that suggested a journey of some considerable distance. Mae wiped her hands on her apron and made her way toward the forge, where Thomas had emerged to greet the unexpected visitors. She recognized Mrs. Patterson by reputation, the widow of a territorial judge who'd built a cattle empire spanning 3 counties before his death 5 years earlier. Eleanor had inherited not only his wealth but also his political connections and his reputation for supporting causes that championed the rights of the vulnerable and oppressed. "Mr. Kane?" Eleanor's voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education tempered by years of frontier pragmatism. "I'm Eleanor Patterson. I believe you may have heard of me." "Yes, ma'am." "What can I do for you?" Thomas's voice carried the respectful tone he used when addressing people of obvious importance, though without the servile deference that many frontier men adopted when confronted with wealth and power. Eleanor dismounted with fluid grace, accepting her bodyguard's assistance with the automatic courtesy of someone accustomed to such service but not dependent upon it. "I understand you're the finest metal worker in this part of the territory, and I find myself in need of some specialized pieces for my new house. Wrought iron fixtures, decorative elements, perhaps some custom hardware for furniture that requires both artistic vision and technical precision." Thomas nodded slowly, clearly trying to gauge where this conversation was headed and what underlying currents might be driving such an unexpected commission. "I could certainly handle work of that nature, Mrs. Patterson. Might I ask how you heard about my services?" "Oh, word travels quickly when someone produces quality craftsmanship that stands out from the usual frontier makeshift." Eleanor's smile held a hint of mischief that suggested there was more to this story than simple business considerations. "I also understand that you're a man of principle, unwilling to compromise your standards for the sake of social pressure or financial incentive. Such integrity is rare enough to be worth seeking out." Mae felt a flush of understanding wash over her like warm water. This wasn't about metalwork at all, or at least not entirely. Eleanor Patterson had heard about the harassment campaign against Thomas and had decided to intervene in her own way, using her considerable influence to provide both financial support and social protection. "I do try to conduct my business honorably," Thomas said carefully, his natural caution warring with curiosity about where this conversation might lead. "Excellent. Then I believe we'll work very well together." Eleanor reached into her reticule and produced a rolled paper that she handed to Thomas with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her gestures received as commands. "This is a list of items I'll need, along with preliminary sketches and specifications. The project will require several months to complete, and I'm prepared to pay half the total fee in advance to secure your exclusive attention." Thomas unrolled the paper, his eyebrows rising as he scanned the contents with the rapid comprehension of someone who understood both the technical requirements and financial implications of complex metalwork. Mae couldn't see the details from where she stood, but she could tell from his expression that the commission was both substantial and lucrative, the kind of project that could establish his reputation far beyond the boundaries of Copper Creek. "This is quite an undertaking," he said after a moment, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious excitement in his eyes. "Some of these pieces would require techniques I've only read about in technical journals." "Indeed it is. I believe in supporting craftsmen who maintain high standards of both work and character, and I'm willing to pay premium prices for results that exceed ordinary expectations. Eleanor's meaning was unmistakable, though delivered with the subtlety that came from years of navigating territorial politics where direct statements could create more problems than they solved. I also believe that a man's reputation should be based on the quality of his work and the integrity of his dealings, not the petty jealousies of those who resent his success or disapprove of his personal choices. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing not just the business opportunity but also the implicit statement of support from someone with the social and political weight to make such protection meaningful. The commission represented more than money. It was validation, respectability, and security all wrapped together in a package that would be difficult for even Haskell's influence to undermine. "I'd be honored to take on the commission, Mrs. Patterson," he said finally, his formal words barely containing his relief and gratitude. "When would you need the first pieces completed?" "No particular rush. Quality work takes time, and I'd rather have things done right than done quickly." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Mae, taking in her work-stained apron and the dirt under her fingernails with the assessing look of someone accustomed to reading character and details others might overlook. "And you must be Miss Whitlock. I've heard you're proving quite invaluable in helping Mr. Kane manage the business side of his operation." Mae bobbed a slight curtsy, uncertain of the proper protocol for addressing someone of Eleanor's standing but determined not to embarrass Thomas with inappropriate behavior. "I try to be useful, ma'am." "I'm sure you do more than that. A woman with your background understands the value of honest work and doesn't take security for granted." Eleanor's words carried a weight that suggested she understood more about Mae's situation than casual gossip would have provided. That kind of practical wisdom is invaluable in any partnership, business or otherwise. The word partnership hung in the air with deliberate emphasis, and Mae felt a flush of warmth at the implicit recognition of her contributions to the Homestead's success. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken of her as a partner rather than a burden or commodity, and hearing it from someone of Eleanor's stature made the acknowledgement feel official and permanent. Eleanor remained for another hour, discussing the details of the commission with Thomas while Mae served coffee and the shortbread cookies she'd learned to make using her mother's recipe and ingredients purchased with her own garden earnings. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from metallurgy techniques to territorial politics, and Mae found herself impressed by both Eleanor's knowledge of craftsmanship and Thomas's ability to hold his own in discussions that ranged far beyond the confines of his forge. As the visitors prepared to leave, Eleanor took Mae aside for a brief private conversation that felt like a maternal blessing disguised as casual advice. "My dear, I want you to know that your situation is not as unusual as you might think," she said in a voice pitched low enough that Thomas couldn't overhear from where he stood examining her horse's shoes for wear. "Many women find themselves in difficult circumstances through no fault of their own, and the wise ones recognize opportunity when it presents itself in unexpected forms." "I'm not sure I understand, ma'am." Mae's confusion was genuine, though she suspected Eleanor was trying to communicate something important about the nature of her relationship with Thomas. "I think you understand perfectly well." Eleanor's smile was kind but knowing, carrying the warmth of someone who'd watched many young people struggle with matters of the heart. "Mr. Kane is a good man, and good men are rarer than hen's teeth in this territory. Don't let fear of what other people might think prevent you from recognizing blessing when it appears in your life." Mae felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name or examine too closely. "Mrs. Patterson, You don't need to explain anything to me, child. Just remember that happiness is too precious to waste on the opinions of people whose judgment isn't worth a plugged nickel anyway." Eleanor patted Mae's hand with maternal kindness, her touch brief but somehow conveying years of accumulated wisdom about the complexities of frontier life. And if anyone gives you trouble, I mean anyone at all, you send word to me immediately. I have a long reach and a longer memory for people who mistreat those under my protection." With that parting shot, Eleanor remounted her horse and rode away with her entourage, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the promise of enough work to keep Thomas busy for months. More importantly, she'd left behind the clear message that he and Mae now enjoyed the protection of one of the most powerful people in the territory, a shield that would make future harassment both difficult and dangerous for potential persecutors. The effects were immediate and dramatic, like watching storm clouds part to reveal brilliant sunshine. Within days, Thomas's forge was once again busy with customers who had suddenly remembered their need for his services, their previous reluctance to do business with him evaporating like morning dew under the heat of Eleanor Patterson's obvious approval. Jeremiah Haskell's influence might carry weight in Copper Creek, but it was nothing compared to Eleanor's reach across the territorial business and political networks. "Looks like things are getting back to normal," Mae observed one evening as they sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky like scattered diamonds on black velvet. "Better than normal," Thomas replied, his voice carrying a contentment she hadn't heard since the harassment campaign began. "That commission from Mrs. Patterson will keep us comfortable through next winter and beyond, maybe even allow us to expand the operation if we're smart about managing the work." "Us." The word slipped out before Mae could stop it, carrying more hope than she'd intended to reveal in what was supposed to be a casual observation about their improving circumstances. Thomas was quiet for so long that she began to worry she'd overstepped some invisible boundary or presumed too much about the nature of their arrangement. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth she'd rarely heard before, like honey stirred into hot tea on a cold morning. "I've gotten used to having you here, Mae. The place feels more like a home with you in it, and I can't imagine trying to manage everything without your help." He paused, and when he continued, his words came slowly, as if he was testing each one for its weight and meaning. "If you're willing to stay, I'd be honored to have you as a permanent partner in this enterprise." "Partner?" She turned to look at him in the gathering darkness, trying to read his expression in the faint light that spilled from the house windows. "Business partner, certainly. The books have never been in better order, and you've got ideas for expanding the operation that I never would have thought of on my own." He paused again, and when he continued, his voice was softer, more hesitant, like someone approaching a skittish horse with gentle words and careful movements. "As for other kinds of partnership, well, I figure that's something we can let develop naturally without pressure or expectations on either side." Mae felt her heart begin to race, but with excitement rather than fear for the first time in months. The idea of a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than legal obligation or economic necessity was almost too wonderful to contemplate, like trying to look directly at the sun. "I'd like that," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that very much." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, two people who'd found something precious in the most unexpected of circumstances. The road ahead would bring its own challenges, Mae knew, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly hopeful about what the future might hold. Summer settled over the homestead like a warm blanket, bringing with it a routine that felt as natural as breathing and twice as satisfying. Mae rose each morning to the sound of Thomas moving quietly through the kitchen, preparing coffee with the same methodical attention he brought to all his work, and their conversations over breakfast had evolved from tentative politeness to the easy exchange of two people who'd learned to trust each other's company and judgment. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned yesterday that her husband's been having trouble with his plow," Mae said one morning, spreading jam on a thick slice of bread she'd baked the previous evening using wheat flour purchased with her garden profits. "The share keeps coming loose no matter how many times he tightens it." Thomas nodded, already making mental notes about the problem and possible solutions. Probably worn threads on the bolt. I can make him a new one, maybe upgrade the whole assembly to something more durable that won't require constant maintenance. She seemed worried about the cost. You know how tight things have been for them since their youngest took sick and they had to pay for medicine from the territorial doctor. We'll work something out. Maybe they've got eggs to spare, or Mrs. Henderson could help with the mending pile that's been growing in the back room. It was typical of Thomas to find ways to help without making people feel like charity cases, his generosity expressed through practical arrangements that preserved dignity while meeting genuine needs. The commission from Eleanor Patterson had indeed transformed their financial situation, but more than that, it had given Thomas the freedom to pick and choose his projects based on interest and need rather than simple survival. He'd begun taking on more artistic work: decorative gates for the banker's mansion, custom fireplace screens for the hotel, intricate weather vanes that were as much sculpture as they were functional instruments. Mae had found her own role expanding beyond bookkeeping and household management into something approaching true partnership. She'd started a small business of her own, selling vegetables and herbs from their expanded garden to families in town who lacked the space or knowledge to grow their own. The income was modest, but it represented something more valuable than money, proof that she could contribute to their partnership as an equal rather than simply a dependent. "The Patterson Commission is coming along well," Thomas said, wiping his hands on the towel Mae kept by the wash basin for his use. "I finished the main gate yesterday, and I think it's some of the best work I've ever done. I'd like to see it." Mae had been fascinated by the evolution of Thomas's craft, watching him transform raw iron into objects of genuine beauty through patient application of heat, force, and artistic vision. "Would you mind showing me? I was hoping you'd ask." His pleasure at her interest was evident in the way his usually serious expression softened into something approaching boyish excitement. "I value your opinion on these things. You see details I sometimes miss, and your suggestions have made several pieces much better." They walked together to the forge, where Thomas had erected a temporary frame to display the completed gate like a masterpiece in a gallery. Mae caught her breath at the sight of it, a masterwork of flowing lines and delicate details that managed to be both sturdy and elegant, functional and beautiful. Roses climbed the vertical bars and twisted iron, their leaves and thorns rendered with startling realism that seemed to capture the very essence of living plants, while the center panel featured an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. "Thomas, it's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers along one of the iron roses with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "I had no idea you could create something like this." "I've been working toward it for years," he admitted, his voice carrying the quiet pride of someone who'd achieved a long-sought goal. "Learning new techniques, studying books on decorative metalwork, practicing on smaller pieces until I felt ready to attempt something truly ambitious. Mrs. Patterson's commission gave me the excuse to finally push myself beyond my usual limitations." "It's not just craftsmanship," Mae said, still studying the gate with wonder and growing appreciation for the complexity of its design. "It's art. You're an artist, Thomas Kane, whether you think of yourself that way or not." He was quiet for a moment, clearly moved by her praise in ways that surprised him with their intensity. "My father always said that any work worth doing was worth doing beautifully. I used to think that was impractical sentiment, but I've come to understand that beauty serves a purpose beyond mere decoration. It lifts the spirit, makes daily life richer, reminds us that humans are capable of creating as well as destroying." Mae nodded, thinking of her own small attempts to bring beauty into their shared space. Wildflowers arranged in mason jars, colorful quilts draped over the furniture, herb gardens planted not just for practical use but for the pleasure of their varied textures and scents. These efforts had seemed insignificant compared to Thomas's dramatic metalwork, but perhaps they served the same essential function of making life more than mere survival. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Thomas's expression immediately grew wary, a reaction Mae had come to recognize as his response to unexpected visitors. Too many surprises in his past had taught him to be cautious about people who appeared without warning, and she'd learned to trust his instincts about potential trouble even when everything seemed perfectly innocent. But these riders came at an easy pace that suggested business rather than conflict. 3 men approached the forge, their clothes and bearing marking them as prosperous ranchers from one of the neighboring counties rather than local troublemakers or representatives of territorial authority. The leader, a man with graying temples and laugh lines around his eyes, dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been stiffened by years of hard work but whose spirit remained undaunted. "Mr. Kane? I'm Robert Mitchell from over in Pine Valley. This is my son David and my neighbor Jim Crawford. We've ridden quite a ways to talk with you about some work we need done, and we're hoping you might be interested in taking on a project that's bigger than anything you've probably handled before." Thomas relaxed slightly but remained alert, his posture suggesting cautious interest rather than immediate acceptance. "What kind of work, Mr. Mitchell?" "We're building a new church in Pine Valley, and we need someone who can create the kind of metalwork that will last generations while serving both practical and spiritual purposes. Door hardware, window fixtures, a bell tower that won't collapse in the first strong wind, decorative elements that will inspire worship and reflect the glory of God's creation. Eleanor Patterson told us you were the man for the job." Mae felt a surge of pride at the recommendation, understanding that Eleanor's influence was clearly extending far beyond their immediate area and opening opportunities that could establish Thomas's reputation across the entire territory. This was the kind of commission that could transform a local craftsman into a regional artist whose name would be spoken with respect in multiple counties. "I'm honored by Mrs. Patterson's confidence," Thomas said carefully, his natural caution warring with obvious excitement about the scope and significance of the proposed project. "But a project of that scope would require months of work and considerable resources. I'd need to see detailed plans and specifications before I could give you a firm estimate." "We brought everything with us," David Mitchell said, producing a leather portfolio from his saddlebags with the efficiency of someone who'd anticipated this request. "The church committee spent months working with an architect from Denver, and we've got complete drawings for everything we'll need." Thomas accepted the portfolio and spread the papers on his work table, Mae moving to stand beside him as they examined the detailed plans together. The proposed church was ambitious in scope, a building designed to serve a growing community for decades to come, with architectural details that would require both technical skill and artistic vision to execute properly. "This is impressive work," Thomas said after studying the drawings for several minutes, his voice carrying the respect one craftsman shows for another's expertise. "The bell tower design is particularly challenging. You'll need ironwork that can support significant weight while withstanding wind loads and thermal expansion over many years of use." "That's exactly why we need the best craftsmen we can find," Robert Mitchell replied, his words carrying the conviction of someone who understood the difference between adequate and excellent work. "We're not looking for the cheapest bid, Mr. Kane. We want quality that will honor the Lord and serve our community for generations to come." Mae watched Thomas's face as he continued studying the plans, seeing the way his eyes lit up with professional interest despite his cautious demeanor. This was the kind of project that could establish his reputation as more than just a local blacksmith. It could mark him as one of the premier artisans in the territory, someone whose work would be sought after by communities throughout the region. The negotiations that followed were complex but cordial, with Mae taking notes as the men discussed specifications, delivery schedules, and payment arrangements with the thoroughness that major projects required. She found herself impressed by Thomas's business acumen. He was neither greedy nor overly modest about his worth, striking a balance that seemed to satisfy all parties while protecting his own interests. By the time the visitors prepared to leave, they had reached a preliminary agreement that would keep Thomas busy for the better part of the next year while providing financial security that would allow them to plan for the future with genuine confidence rather than mere hope. After the men had ridden away, Thomas and Mae stood together beside the forge, both still somewhat stunned by the magnitude of the opportunity that had just presented itself like an unexpected gift from Providence. "A year's worth of work," Mae said softly, her voice carrying wonder at how quickly their circumstances had transformed. "And not just any work, the kind of project that artists dream about. It's more responsibility than I've ever taken on," Thomas admitted, his honesty about his concerns making his willingness to accept the challenge even more admirable. "But you're right, it's the chance to create something truly significant, something that will outlast both of us and serve God's purposes for generations." "We'll manage it together," Mae said, surprised by her own certainty and the strength it seemed to give her words. "The business side, the scheduling, the coordination with other craftsmen, that's work I can handle while you focus on the creative and technical aspects." Thomas turned to look at her with an expression she'd never seen before, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more personal and intimate than professional appreciation. "I don't know what I did to deserve a partner like you, Mae Whitlock." The word partner sent familiar warmth through her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something new, a sense of belonging that went beyond mere convenience or mutual benefit. Somewhere in the months since the auction, their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had dared to hope for when this all began. A genuine partnership built on respect, trust, and growing affection. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of activity that left both Thomas and Mae feeling as though time itself had accelerated to match their newfound sense of purpose and possibility. Thomas began preliminary work on the church commission, creating sample pieces and perfecting techniques he would need for the larger project, while Mae expanded her garden business and took on increasing responsibility for managing the complex scheduling that multiple major projects required. Their evenings were spent on the porch, sharing the day's events and planning for the challenges ahead, conversations that had grown increasingly personal as trust deepened between them like roots extending through fertile soil. "I never thought I'd have the chance to create something lasting," Thomas confided one evening as they watched fireflies dance among the cottonwoods like earthbound stars. "When I was younger, I dreamed of being an artist, but life kept pushing me toward more practical concerns, toward survival rather than beauty." "What changed?" Mae asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer and wanted to hear him speak the words that would make their growing connection explicit. "You," he said simply, his voice carrying a sincerity that took her breath away. "Having someone who believes in the work, who sees it as more than just a way to make money, that changes everything. It makes me want to push harder, reach higher than I ever thought possible." Mae felt her heart skip at the quiet intensity in his voice, at the way he credited her with inspiring him to greatness when she'd done nothing more than recognize the talent that had always been there. "I've never met anyone who could transform raw metal into beauty the way you do. Watching you work is like watching magic happen, like witnessing the act of creation itself." "It's not magic," Thomas said with a slight smile that somehow made his denial less convincing. "It's patience, practice, and a willingness to fail until you get it right. The same qualities you bring to everything you touch. The garden, the books, the way you've helped me turn this place into a real home instead of just a place where I sleep and work." They were sitting closer together than usual on the porch swing Thomas had built earlier that summer, their shoulders almost touching in a way that felt both natural and charged with possibility. Mae was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way the lamplight from inside the house cast warm shadows across his profile and made his eyes seem to glow with inner fire. "Thomas?" Her voice came out softer than she'd intended, barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets and distant cattle. "Yes." "What Mrs. Patterson said about partnerships. I've been thinking about what that might mean for us, about what we might be building here together." He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious in the gathering darkness, searching her face as if trying to read secrets written in a language he was still learning. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I'd like to find out," she said, her heart racing at her own boldness but unable to retreat from the truth of her feelings. "If you're willing to explore that possibility with me." Instead of answering with words, Thomas reached out to gently cup her face in his work-roughened hand, the touch tender and questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she chose. When she leaned into his palm instead, covering his hand with her own, his breath caught audibly in the quiet evening air. "I've wanted to ask," he whispered, his voice carrying years of loneliness and hope. "But I didn't want you to feel pressured or obligated. Your freedom to choose is too important to risk, too precious to compromise for my own desires." "I am choosing," Mae said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with fingertips that trembled with emotion. "I'm choosing you, Thomas Kane. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because I love you." When he kissed her, it was with the same careful attention he brought to his finest work. Gentle but sure, respectful of her inexperience while making his own feelings unmistakably clear. Mae felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to sunlight, a happiness so pure and unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes and made her understand for the first time what the poets meant when they wrote about the transformative power of love. They held each other on the porch swing as the night deepened around them, talking in whispers about the future they might build together, about marriage and children and the kind of life they dared to dream might be possible. The conversation felt both momentous and natural, like the inevitable conclusion to months of growing trust and affection. "I want to do this properly," Thomas said as they finally prepared to go inside, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood the importance of treating precious things with appropriate reverence. "Court you the way you deserve to be courted, give you time to be certain of your feelings without pressure from circumstances or convenience." "How much time do you think I need?" Mae asked with a smile that held just a hint of mischief, her happiness making her bold in ways that surprised her. "However long it takes for you to be absolutely sure. We've got the rest of our lives to figure this out, and I'd rather take it slow than risk rushing into something that might not be built on solid foundations." But as autumn approached with its promise of harvest and preparation for winter, it became clear that not everyone in the community was pleased with the developments at the Kane homestead. The whispered conversations that had died down after Eleanor Patterson's intervention began to resurface like weeds growing through cracks in seemingly solid ground, fueled by jealousy and the kind of moral outrage that some people seem to reserve for other folks' happiness. The trouble began with seemingly innocent comments in the general store and post office. Observations about how quickly Mae had made herself comfortable in Thomas's house, speculation about the true nature of their arrangement, and thinly veiled suggestions that perhaps things weren't as respectable as they appeared on the surface. Mae first became aware of the renewed gossip during a routine trip to town for supplies, her happiness making her careless about the undercurrents of malice that flowed beneath the surface of frontier social interactions. She was examining a bolt of fabric for a new dress when she overheard Mrs. Clegg talking to the storekeeper's wife in voices pitched just loud enough to ensure they would be overheard by their intended target. "Well, I'm just saying it's peculiar how quickly she settled into that house like she belonged there all along. Most women in her situation would be making arrangements to move on, find a more permanent solution to their circumstances. Perhaps she has found a permanent solution, Mrs. Henderson replied with false innocence that fooled no one. Though one does wonder about the propriety of such arrangements, especially for someone who was raised to know better. "Oh, I'm sure everything is perfectly proper," Mrs. Clegg said with a tone that suggested the exact opposite. "After all, Mr. Kane seems like such a gentleman. I'm sure he would never take advantage of a young woman's gratitude or vulnerable position, no matter how grateful she might feel." Mae felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger, but she forced herself to complete her purchases with dignity intact. She would not give these women the satisfaction of seeing how their words affected her, nor would she provide them with additional gossip by responding to their provocations with either tears or sharp words. But the incident left her shaken in ways she hadn't expected. The happiness she'd found with Thomas suddenly feeling fragile and exposed to attack from people who seemed determined to find scandal where none existed. The malicious pleasure in their voices suggested that this was just the beginning of a campaign designed to undermine everything she and Thomas had built together. "You're quiet tonight," Thomas observed as they sat down to supper, his concern evident in the way he studied her face for signs of distress. "Everything all right?" Mae hesitated, torn between her desire to protect him from unpleasantness and her need to share the burden of what she'd experienced. "There's been talk in town. About us, about our arrangement, about whether we're conducting ourselves properly." Thomas's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "What kind of talk?" "The kind you'd expect from people with small minds and too much time on their hands." Mae tried to keep her voice light, but she could hear the strain beneath her attempted nonchalance. "Nothing specific, just innuendo and speculation designed to cast doubt on our character." "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly, his anger clearly directed at the gossips rather than at her for bringing him the news. "I was hoping we were past all that nonsense after Mrs. Patterson's visit. It's not your fault. Some people just can't stand to see others find happiness, especially when it doesn't fit their narrow ideas about how things should be done." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with difficult thoughts and unwelcome possibilities. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Mae's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Maybe we should make things official sooner rather than later. A formal engagement, a wedding date set for this fall. That would give the gossips less to work with and establish our relationship in terms that even the most suspicious minds would have to respect." Mae stared at him, her heart sinking despite the fact that he was essentially proposing marriage. "Thomas, I don't want you to marry me just to stop people from talking." "That's not why." He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration at his inability to express complex emotions with the same precision he brought to his metalwork. "Mae, I want to marry you because I love you. Because I can't imagine my life without you in it. The gossip just makes it more urgent, that's all." "Do you love me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, carrying all the vulnerability she'd been trying to hide beneath practical concerns and social conventions. "More than I ever thought possible," he said without hesitation, his words ringing with absolute sincerity. "I thought that was obvious from everything I've said and done. You've never said it before, not in so many words. I've never been good with words. I tend to show my feelings rather than speak them, but if you need to hear it, I'll say it as often as you like." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand, his touch warm and steady and infinitely reassuring. "I love you, Mae Whitlock. I love your strength, your kindness, your brilliant mind, and the way you make everything around you more beautiful. I love the life we've built together and the future I see when I look into your eyes." Tears spilled down Mae's cheeks as she absorbed the words she'd been longing to hear, the explicit declaration that made their growing connection feel real and permanent rather than something that might disappear like morning mist. "I love you too, Thomas. More than I ever knew it was possible to love someone. Then let's get married, he said simply, his proposal carrying all the weight of absolute certainty. Not because of what other people might say, but because we want to spend our lives together. Let's make this real and legal and permanent. Yes, Mae whispered, her heart full to overflowing with joy and relief and anticipation. Yes, I want that more than anything. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about wedding dates and celebration details with the excitement of two people who had found something precious and wanted to treasure it properly. The gossip that had seemed so threatening just hours earlier faded into insignificance beside the joy of their shared commitment and the promise of a future built on love rather than convenience. But their happiness was destined to face one more significant test before they could claim the peaceful future they envisioned. The challenge came from an unexpected quarter and would require all their combined strength to overcome, threatening not just their relationship but the very foundation of the new life Thomas had built in Copper Creek. It was late September when the stranger arrived in town, asking questions about Thomas Kane and showing particular interest in his background before settling in the territory. The man claimed to be a journalist working on a series of articles about successful frontier businesses, but his questions carried an edge that suggested more personal interest than professional curiosity, a hunger for secrets that went beyond mere documentation. Mae first heard about the visitor from Mrs. Henderson, who mentioned him while purchasing vegetables for the week's meals, her usual gossipy demeanor replaced by something approaching worry. "Strangest thing," the older woman said, counting out coins for a basket of late tomatoes with unusual care. "He wanted to know all about Thomas's past, where he came from before he showed up here, whether he'd ever mentioned family or previous employment. Asked questions about his habits, his associates, whether he'd ever seemed nervous about his past being discovered." A chill of premonition ran down Mae's spine like ice water, her instincts warning her that this was more than casual curiosity. Thomas had always been private about his past, sharing only fragments that painted an incomplete picture of his life before Copper Creek. She'd respected his reticence, understanding that some wounds were too deep for casual examination, but now she wondered if there were specific reasons for his secrecy beyond mere preference for privacy. "What did you tell him?" Mae asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the growing sense of alarm. "I told him it wasn't any of my business where a man came from, long as he conducted himself properly once he got here. But he was persistent, kept pushing for details about his arrival, about whether he seemed to have money when he first appeared, about any letters or visitors he might have received over the years." That evening, Mae mentioned the journalist to Thomas as casually as she could manage, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition or concern. His reaction was immediate and alarming. All the color drained from his face, and his hand tightened around his coffee cup with enough force that she feared the ceramic might crack under the pressure. "What did he look like?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully controlled in the way that suggested he was fighting to maintain composure. Mae described what Mrs. Henderson had told her, watching Thomas's expression grow increasingly grim with each detail. When she finished, he sat in silence for so long that she began to fear the worst, her imagination conjuring scenarios that ranged from outstanding debts to criminal charges to vengeful enemies seeking retribution. "Thomas, what is it? Who is this man?" "Someone from my past," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Someone I hope never to see again." "Is he dangerous?" Thomas was quiet for another long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal and how to frame revelations that might fundamentally alter her perception of him. "Not in the way you mean. But he could be problematic for us. For the life we're trying to build here." "Tell me," Mae said simply, reaching across to cover his hands with her own. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Thomas looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with deep pain, the look of someone who'd carried a heavy burden alone for too long. I've never told you why I came to Copper Creek, why I left my previous life behind. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. I was married before, he said, the words coming out in a rush as if saying them quickly might make them hurt less. Her name was Sarah, and she died because of choices I made, mistakes that I can never undo. Mae felt her heart clench with sympathy for the pain in his voice, but she kept her expression calm and encouraging, understanding that this revelation was costing him everything he had. What happened? We lived in a mining town in Colorado, and I worked as a blacksmith for one of the big companies. There was corruption, safety violations that were putting miners' lives at risk, and I tried to expose it. I thought I was doing the right thing, fighting for justice. Thomas's voice grew bitter with self-recrimination. Instead, I painted a target on my back and made enemies of some very powerful, very dangerous men. And Sarah? She was caught in the crossfire when they came for me. A fire at our house that was meant to be a warning became something much worse when the wind shifted and the flames spread faster than anyone anticipated. Thomas's hands were shaking now, and Mae reached across to cover them with her own. She died trying to save our neighbor's children. I was at the mine when it happened, completely unaware until I came home to find everything I'd ever loved reduced to ash and bone. Oh, Thomas. Mae's heart broke for the young man who'd tried to do right and lost everything because of it. I'm so sorry. The man asking questions. His name is Daniel Morrison, and he was one of the journalists who covered the story. He knows everything about my past, about the accusations and the investigation that followed Sarah's death. If he's here, it means someone has tracked me down, and that could put you in danger just by association. Mae squeezed his hands tighter, her mind racing as she processed this revelation and its implications for their future. What kind of danger? I don't know yet. Maybe nothing more than unwanted attention and old scandals dragged into the light. But those men I crossed in Colorado have long reaches and longer memories. If they've decided I'm worth pursuing after all these years, then we'll face whatever comes, Mae said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. I'm not afraid of your past, Thomas. I'm only afraid of losing our future. He looked at her with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe her reaction to revelations that he'd expected would drive her away. You don't understand. If this story gets out, it could destroy everything we've built here. Your reputation, my business, our chance at a normal life. Our life together is worth fighting for, Mae replied without hesitation, her words carrying the conviction of someone who'd found something precious and refused to surrender it without a battle. Whatever this Morrison wants, whatever story he thinks he's chasing, we'll deal with it. Together. Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her with desperate gratitude as the weight of his secret finally lifted from his shoulders. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people preparing to face an uncertain future with the strength that came from absolute trust in each other. The confrontation with Morrison came 2 days later, on a crisp October morning when the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Mae was hanging the last of their laundry when she spotted the lone rider approaching the homestead at an unhurried pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Even from a distance, she could tell this was their mysterious journalist, a slight man with prematurely gray hair who sat his horse with the careful posture of someone more accustomed to desk work than frontier travel. Thomas emerged from the forge at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, his face set in lines of grim determination. They'd spent the previous evening talking through various scenarios and strategies, but Mae could see the tension in his shoulders despite their careful preparation. Mr. Kane? Morrison dismounted with the stiff movements of someone who'd been riding longer than comfort dictated. I'm Daniel Morrison from the Denver Post. I wonder if I might have a word with you about a story I'm researching. I figured you'd get around to me eventually, Thomas replied, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious strain of maintaining composure. What brings you all the way out here, Mr. Morrison? Morrison's smile held no warmth, more the expression of a predator that had finally cornered its prey after a long and patient hunt. Oh, I think you know exactly why I'm here, Thomas. Or should I say Thomas Brennan? Mae felt her breath catch at the use of a different surname, but she forced herself to remain calm and supportive. Thomas had warned her that his current identity might not be his original name, though they hadn't discussed the specifics of how he'd managed such a transformation. That name doesn't mean anything to me, Thomas said steadily, his voice betraying nothing of the turmoil that Mae knew must be churning beneath his composed exterior. I'm Thomas Kane, legally documented resident of this territory and owner of this property. Interesting that you say, legally documented, Morrison said, pulling a small notebook from his vest pocket with theatrical precision. Because I've done some research into how one goes about changing identities on the frontier, and it's fascinating how many people manage to reinvent themselves with nothing more than a few forged papers and enough cash to grease the right palms. Are you accusing me of something specific, Mr. Morrison? Because if so, I'd appreciate you getting to the point instead of dancing around with innuendo and speculation. Morrison's laugh was unpleasant, like the sound of glass breaking against stone. Oh, I'm not accusing you of anything, Thomas. I'm simply here to verify some facts for a story I'm writing about the mysterious fire that killed Sarah Brennan and 3 children in Millbrook, Colorado, 3 years ago. You remember Sarah, don't you? Your wife. The silence that followed was thick with tension and barely contained emotion. Mae could see Thomas struggling with the impulse to deny everything versus the knowledge that Morrison clearly had enough information to make such denials pointless and potentially damaging. What do you want? Thomas asked finally, his voice tight with controlled anger and growing desperation. The truth, Morrison said with false righteousness that made Mae's skin crawl with revulsion. The people of Colorado deserve to know what really happened in Millbrook, and whether the man responsible for those deaths has been living comfortably under an assumed name while the families of his victims still grieve. I didn't kill anyone, Thomas said, his voice rising slightly despite his obvious efforts to remain calm and reasonable. The fire was an accident, a tragedy that I would give anything to undo. An accident that happened to occur just days after you'd made very public accusations against some very powerful men. An accident that conveniently eliminated the one witness who could have corroborated your claims about safety violations and corporate corruption. Mae stepped forward then, unable to remain silent any longer in the face of Morrison's obvious enjoyment of Thomas's pain and distress. Mr. Morrison, if you have accusations to make, perhaps you should make them to the proper authorities rather than spreading gossip and innuendo like some common scandalmonger. Morrison turned his attention to her with the kind of calculating look that made her skin crawl with disgust. And you must be the young woman who was auctioned off like cattle and bought by our mysterious blacksmith. How interesting that Thomas Kane has such a talent for rescuing damsels in distress. That's enough, Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning that made Morrison take an unconscious step backward toward his horse. You want to drag up my past, fine. You want to rehash old tragedies for the sake of selling newspapers, I can't stop you. But you'll treat Miss Whitlock with respect, or this conversation ends right now. Miss Whitlock. Morrison's eyebrows rose with malicious interest and barely concealed glee. How charmingly old-fashioned. Though I understand congratulations are in order on your upcoming marriage. One does hope the bride is aware of her fiancé's complete history before she commits herself to such a union. Mae felt a surge of protective anger on Thomas's behalf that surprised her with its intensity and clarity. Mr. Morrison, I know everything I need to know about the man I'm going to marry. He's honest, hardworking, and kind, qualities that seem to be in short supply among people who make their living digging up other folks' pain for profit. Morrison's smile turned genuinely nasty, revealing the ugly character beneath his veneer of professional respectability. How wonderfully loyal. I'm sure that loyalty will be deeply appreciated when the story runs and the good people of Copper Creek learn they've been harboring a fugitive who may well be responsible for the deaths of 4 innocent people. I'm not a fugitive, Thomas said through gritted teeth, his control finally beginning to fray under the sustained assault. There were no charges filed, no warrants issued. The territorial authorities investigated the fire thoroughly and concluded it was accidental. Ah yes, the territorial investigation, Morrison said, consulting his notebook with theatrical precision designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Conducted by Sheriff Pete Hawkins, who coincidentally received a rather substantial anonymous donation to his retirement fund shortly after closing the case. Amazing how thorough investigations can be when properly motivated. Thomas went very still, and Mae could see the moment when he realized the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about old gossip or resurrected scandal. Morrison had evidence of corruption that could retroactively cast doubt on the official findings about the fire, potentially reopening a case that had been closed for years. What do you want? Thomas asked again, his voice deadly quiet and carefully controlled. An exclusive interview, Morrison said promptly, his demands clearly rehearsed and ready. Your side of the story told in your own words. Cooperation with my investigation into what really happened in Millbrook, and perhaps some insight into how you managed your remarkable transformation from Thomas Brennan to Thomas Kane. And if I refuse? Then I write the story without your input, using only the facts I've already gathered and the speculation of interested parties. Morrison's shrug was elaborately casual, designed to suggest that Thomas's cooperation was optional when they all knew it wasn't. I imagine it will make for compelling reading, though perhaps not as flattering to your character as a version that includes your perspective. Mae could see Thomas weighing his options, none of which offered a clear path to victory or even acceptable compromise. Morrison held all the cards and they both knew it. The only question was whether cooperation might limit the damage or simply provide the journalist with additional ammunition to use against them. I need time to think about it, Thomas said finally, buying them breathing room to formulate a strategy. Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel in town for the next few days while I gather additional information and interview other sources. Morrison remounted his horse with the same careful movements, his satisfaction evident in every gesture. Oh, and Thomas? I'd strongly recommend against any thoughts of disappearing again. I have associates in several territories now, and running would only confirm the suspicions of those who believe you have something to hide. After Morrison rode away, Thomas and Mae stood together in the yard, both struggling to process the magnitude of the threat they now faced. The peaceful life they'd built together suddenly felt fragile as spun glass, vulnerable to destruction by forces completely beyond their control. I'm sorry, Thomas said finally, his voice heavy with guilt and self-recrimination. I should have told you everything from the beginning. Should have found a way to warn you what association with me might cost. Stop, Mae said firmly, her voice cutting through his spiral of guilt with sharp precision. I meant what I said, we face this together. But I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Tell me everything, Thomas. All of it. They spent the rest of the morning sitting at the kitchen table while Thomas unraveled the complete story of his past, holding nothing back as he revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had driven him to Copper Creek. The corruption he'd uncovered had been systematic and deadly, involving mine owners who cut costs by using inferior safety equipment, foremen who ignored dangerous conditions, and officials who looked the other way in exchange for regular payments. The evidence was damning enough to destroy careers and potentially result in criminal charges against several highly placed officials, Thomas explained, his voice heavy with the weight of old memories. We took everything to the territorial governor's office, demanded a full investigation. For a few days, it looked like justice might actually prevail. But their victory had been short-lived. The threats had started within a week of their testimony, escalating from anonymous notes to direct confrontations to the fire that had claimed Sarah's life and destroyed everything Thomas had worked to build. "I know who ordered it," Thomas said quietly, his hands clenched into fists as he relived the horror of that night. "But I could never prove it, and trying would only have resulted in more deaths. So I buried my wife and those innocent children, sold everything I couldn't carry, and disappeared." Mae listened without judgment, her heart breaking for the man who'd carried this burden alone for so long. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her and considering their options going forward. "Morrison's not just here for a story," she said finally. "Someone sent him. Someone who wants to finish what they started 3 years ago. Probably. But knowing that doesn't help us figure out how to deal with it." "Maybe it does." Mae's mind was working furiously, sorting through possibilities and strategies with the same methodical approach she brought to organizing his business records. If Morrison's working for someone else, then he's not the real threat. He's just a tool, and tools can be broken or turned to other purposes. Over the next 2 days, Mae threw herself into preparation with the same focused intensity she brought to all her projects. She rode into town to consult with Eleanor Patterson, who listened to the situation with the calculating attention of someone accustomed to political warfare and understood immediately what was at stake. "The key is controlling the narrative," Eleanor explained during their private meeting at the Patterson mansion. "Morrison wants to paint Thomas as a dangerous fugitive hiding from justice. We need to reframe him as a victim of corruption who's been unjustly persecuted for trying to protect innocent minors." "But how do we prove that without evidence?" Mae asked, her frustration evident in voice and gesture. "My dear girl, this is the frontier. Evidence is less important than character witnesses and community support. If enough respected people vouch for Thomas's integrity, Morrison's implications will carry less weight than his facts deserve." Eleanor's political connections proved invaluable in the campaign that followed. Within 24 hours, Mae had statements of support from territorial officials, mining safety advocates, and even family members of some of the Millbrook victims who'd remained convinced that Thomas had been trying to help rather than harm their loved ones. The interview Morrison had demanded took place on a Thursday afternoon in the hotel's small dining room, with half the town somehow finding reasons to linger nearby. Thomas had spent hours preparing his responses with Mae's help, crafting answers that were truthful without being defensive, that acknowledged his pain without admitting guilt. Morrison began with his usual aggressive approach, asking pointed questions about Thomas's identity change and the suspicious timing of the fire. But Thomas was ready for him, responding with calm dignity that contrasted sharply with the journalist's obvious attempts to provoke emotional reactions that would make good copy. "Mr. Morrison," Thomas said when pressed about his motivations for leaving Colorado, "I lost everything I loved in that fire. My wife, my home, my faith in justice, all of it gone in one terrible night. I came here seeking peace, not because I was running from guilt but because I couldn't bear to stay in a place where every street corner reminded me of what I'd lost. Yet you continued to use a false name even after establishing yourself here. Why maintain the deception if you had nothing to hide? Because I learned that truth and justice aren't always the same thing on the frontier. I'd seen what happened to people who challenged powerful interests, and I wasn't willing to risk bringing that kind of danger to another community. The interview continued for nearly 2 hours, with Morrison becoming increasingly frustrated as Thomas refused to be baited into admissions or emotional outbursts. Mae watched from across the room, proud of the dignity with which Thomas handled questions that were clearly designed to trap him into damaging statements. The turning point came when Morrison made the mistake of questioning Thomas's relationship with Mae, suggesting that his pattern of rescuing vulnerable women indicated predatory behavior rather than genuine compassion. The dining room had grown quiet during the interview, with local residents straining to hear every word. But Morrison's implication about Mae triggered an immediate and vocal response from several women in the crowd, including Mrs. Henderson and even Mrs. Clegg, who'd been among Mae's harshest critics just months earlier. "That's enough," Mrs. Henderson declared, rising from her table with the authority of someone who'd lived in Copper Creek longer than anyone else. "Thomas Kane has been nothing but respectful to every woman in this town, and Mae Whitlock is lucky to have found such a good man." "Indeed," added Mrs. Clegg, surprising everyone including herself with her vehement defense. "Whatever happened in Colorado, it's plain to anyone with eyes that Mr. Kane is a gentleman of sterling character." Other voices joined the chorus of support, creating a groundswell of community endorsement that Morrison clearly hadn't expected. His carefully planned ambush had backfired spectacularly, turning into a public demonstration of the respect and affection Thomas had earned through years of honest dealing. The interview ended with Morrison looking flustered and defensive, his notebook full of quotes that painted Thomas as a victim rather than a villain. But Mae knew the real battle would be fought in whatever story Morrison ultimately chose to write. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas and Mae held hands and waited to learn their fate. They'd done everything possible to control the damage, but the final outcome remained in the hands of a man who'd shown little inclination toward fairness or mercy. "Whatever happens," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying years of hard-won wisdom, "I want you to know that loving you has been worth every risk, every complication. You've given me back my faith in the possibility of happiness. And you've shown me what real partnership looks like," Mae replied, her words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Not one person owning another, but two people choosing to build something beautiful together." They might have continued in this vein, but their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the homestead. In the gathering darkness, Mae could make out a substantial group of riders, far too many for a casual social visit. Thomas tensed beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept beside the front door. After the confrontation with Morrison, unexpected visitors carried the potential for trouble that neither of them could afford to ignore. But as the riders drew closer, Mae recognized Eleanor Patterson's distinctive silhouette leading the group, along with what appeared to be half the respectable citizens of Copper Creek. The procession included the banker, the doctor, Reverend Matthews, and even some of the ranchers from neighboring spreads who'd heard about the situation and come to offer their support. "Thomas," Eleanor called out as she dismounted, her voice carrying satisfaction and barely contained triumph. "I thought you should know that Mr. Morrison received some interesting news this afternoon. It seems his editor in Denver has decided not to run his story after all." "What?" Thomas rose from the porch swing, his voice carrying disbelief and cautious hope. "It appears that several prominent citizens wrote letters questioning both Morrison's methods and his sources," Eleanor continued, her smile widening as she delivered the good news. When combined with some rather damaging information about Morrison's own questionable practices as a journalist, the paper decided the story wasn't worth the potential legal complications. Mae felt her knees go weak with relief, the crushing weight of uncertainty finally lifting from her shoulders. "It's over?" "Oh, my dear girl, it's more than over," Eleanor said with obvious satisfaction. Morrison left town this afternoon with his tail between his legs, and I doubt he'll be back. As for his mysterious employer, well, sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to stand up to them publicly. Powerful men who operate in shadows tend to retreat when exposed to sunlight. The group that had accompanied Eleanor began to disperse, but not before each person took the time to offer personal words of support and congratulation to Thomas and Mae. The demonstration of community solidarity was overwhelming, a testament to the respect and affection Thomas had earned through years of honest work and fair dealing. "I reckon we've all known for months that you two belong together," Reverend Matthews said with a warm smile, shaking Thomas's hand with genuine enthusiasm. "It's about time you made it official. The church in Pine Valley will need dedication services once the construction's complete," added Robert Mitchell, who'd ridden over from the neighboring county specifically to offer his support. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have providing the metalwork for God's house than a man of proven integrity." As the last of the visitors departed, Thomas and Mae found themselves alone once again, standing in the doorway of their home with the weight of crisis finally lifted from their shoulders. The future that had seemed so uncertain just hours earlier now stretched before them bright with possibility and promise. "I can't believe it's really over," Mae said softly, leaning against Thomas's shoulder as they watched the riders disappear into the darkness. "Eleanor Patterson is a formidable woman," Thomas replied, his voice carrying deep gratitude and no small amount of awe. "I never imagined she had that kind of reach, or that she'd be willing to use it on our behalf. She believes in protecting people who can't protect themselves," Mae observed. "Just like you did when you saved me from that auction block." Thomas turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "I didn't save you, Mae. We saved each other." The truth of that statement settled between them like a blessing, acknowledging the mutual rescue that had brought them together and sustained them through every challenge they'd faced. Neither had been whole when they met, both carrying wounds that seemed too deep to heal, but together they'd found a completeness that neither had dared to hope for. "So what happens now?" Mae asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Now we get married," Thomas said with a smile that transformed his usually serious face into something approaching boyish joy. "We build that church in Pine Valley, we expand the homestead, maybe start a family of our own. We live the life we've been planning, without looking over our shoulders or worrying about shadows from the past." "I'd like that," Mae whispered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with fingers that no longer trembled with uncertainty. "I'd like that very much." When he kissed her this time, it was with the passion of a man who no longer had to hold anything back, who could finally embrace the future without reservation or fear. Mae responded with equal fervor, pouring years of loneliness and hope into the connection between them, sealing a promise that had been building since the day he'd stepped forward at the auction to claim her freedom. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a crisp November morning when the air carried the promise of winter but the sun still held enough warmth to make the day perfect for celebration. Eleanor Patterson had insisted on hosting the ceremony at her mansion, transforming the grand parlor into a chapel fit for a queen with flowers, candles, and decorations that spoke of both wealth and genuine affection for the couple being honored. Mae wore a dress of ivory silk that Eleanor had commissioned from a seamstress in Denver, the fabric flowing around her like liquid starlight and making her feel more beautiful than she'd ever imagined possible. Thomas stood at the makeshift altar in a new black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his blue eyes seem to glow with inner fire, his usual serious expression replaced by uncontainable happiness. The guest list included not just the citizens of Copper Creek but representatives from neighboring communities who'd come to witness the union of two people whose love story had already become local legend. The auction that had begun as Mae's nightmare had transformed into the foundation of their shared dream, a reminder that even the darkest circumstances could give birth to unexpected joy. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with a kind of warmth and dignity that made even the most hardened ranchers reach for their handkerchiefs, his words about love, commitment, and partnership resonating with everyone present. When Thomas and Mae exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to stand together through whatever challenges the future might bring, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "I promise to love you not just for who you are, but for who you help me become," Mae said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams and share your burdens, to build a life with you that honors both our past struggles and our future hopes." Thomas's response was equally heartfelt, delivered in the measured tones that had become so dear to her over the months of their courtship. "I promise to protect not just your safety but your freedom, to never take for granted the gift of your love, and to work every day to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me. I promise to be your husband, your partner, and your friend for all the days of our lives." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers that erupted from the assembled guests could be heard clear across the valley, a joyous celebration of two hearts that had found their perfect match despite all the odds against them. The reception that followed was a testament to the community's affection for the couple, with food, music, and dancing that continued well into the evening hours. Eleanor had spared no expense in creating a celebration worthy of the occasion, but the true magic came from the genuine happiness of everyone present, the sense that they were witnessing something special and rare. "To Thomas and Mae Kane," Eleanor said, raising her glass of champagne in a toast that brought the entire gathering to their feet. "May your love story inspire others to believe in the power of second chances and the possibility of finding happiness in the most unexpected places." The toast was echoed throughout the room, followed by speeches from friends and neighbors who shared memories of watching the couple's relationship develop from tentative partnership to deep and abiding love. Even Jeremiah Haskell had grudgingly attended, his earlier animosity replaced by the kind of respectful distance that acknowledged defeat with as much grace as he could muster. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Thomas and Mae found themselves alone on Eleanor's grand terrace, looking out over the valley that had become their home. The stars overhead seemed brighter than usual, as if the universe itself was celebrating their union, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. "Are you happy, Mrs. Kane?" Thomas asked, using her new name with obvious pleasure and no small amount of wonder. "Happier than I ever imagined possible, Mr. Kane," Mae replied, leaning into the warmth of his embrace as they contemplated the future that stretched before them. They had work ahead of them, the church commission to complete, the homestead to expand, a family to build and nurture. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and difficulty that would test their resolve and commitment. But they would face it all together as partners in the truest sense of the word, their love providing the foundation for whatever storms might come. The winter that followed was the happiest of either of their lives, filled with quiet evenings by the fire, shared projects that brought them closer together, and the deep contentment that came from building a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Thomas worked on the church commission with renewed inspiration, creating pieces that were not just technically excellent but infused with the joy and hope that characterized his new life. Mae expanded her garden business and began teaching reading to children in the community, finding fulfillment in sharing the gift of literacy that her mother had given her so many years earlier. She also discovered that she was expecting their first child, news that filled both her and Thomas with a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate everything around them. "A new generation," Thomas said, his hand resting gently on Mae's still flat stomach as they sat together planning the nursery. "Someone who'll grow up knowing they're wanted and loved, never doubting their place in the world. Someone who'll know the value of honest work and true partnership," Mae added, her own hand covering his as they contemplated the miracle growing within her. Someone who'll understand that love isn't about ownership but about choosing each other every single day. The baby was born the following autumn, a daughter they named Sarah Hope Kane in honor of Thomas's first wife and the future they were building together. The birth was attended by Eleanor Patterson and half the women in Copper Creek, turning what might have been a difficult experience into a celebration of community and new life. As Thomas held his daughter for the first time, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude and wonder, Mae knew they had truly found their happily ever after. Not the fairy tale ending that required perfection, but the real-world happiness that came from choosing love over fear, partnership over possession, and hope over despair. The church in Pine Valley was dedicated the following spring, with Thomas's metalwork serving as the crowning glory of a structure that would serve the community for generations to come. The bell tower rang out across the valley for the first time during the dedication service, its clear tones carrying a message of faith, hope, and the enduring power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful. Standing together in the church they had helped to build, holding their daughter between them as the congregation sang hymns of praise and thanksgiving, Thomas and Mae Kane embodied the truth that some love stories are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth celebrating for all the days of their lives. The silent blacksmith had found his voice through love, and the girl who had been sold like chattel had discovered her worth as a partner and equal. Together, they had defied every expectation and created something magnificent from the ashes of their separate sorrows, proving that sometimes the most beautiful endings begin with the most unlikely beginnings. Their love story would be told and retold throughout the territory for generations to come, inspiring others to believe in second chances and the transformative power of genuine partnership. And in the years that followed, as their family grew and their business prospered, Thomas and Mae never forgot the auction block where their story began, always remembering that the greatest treasures in life often come disguised as the deepest tragedies. They had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together, creating a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And if that wasn't a happily ever after worth celebrating, then nothing was.